Well, I am going to assume that it is the tradition to start relatively close to on time. So I'm going to start now. My name is Cindy Bettinger. I've been a Charleston citizen since 1977. So I am now a townie because I've been here long enough and I know some people. This is my friend Lynn Henderson. She has been a quilting partner of mine for about half of that 33 years. Thank you for coming. I wanted to start out by asking, are there any quilters here? All right. So we've got a couple. I would like to know, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being a rank beginner and 5 being an expert, what would you call yourself? A 2? Okay. A 2? Really? Are you being modest? All right. Well, I consider myself a 5, and I am being realistic, I think. And I'm not trying to boast, but it is taken that way sometimes. Anybody have quilters in the family? Okay. Live now? Okay. So past generations in your case. Okay. There is a tradition in this country for quilting that goes back to the founding of this country. And up until the mid-20th century, it was essentially utilitarian. Almost all quilting was for the purpose of making blankets and keeping your family warm and using scraps so that you were being an efficient and economical housewife. And women didn't work out in the world, and so they had to have these skills. There were no Walmarts, there were no department stores, and they had to be able to make the blankets for the house. So why not make them pretty? Why not use up the scraps? And then in the mid-90s, well, from the middle of the 20th century until the 21st century, a transformation began to happen. It was kind of an identity crisis across all parts of the women's world. Women were getting jobs. Women were finding out that they could do a lot more than just be homemakers, and some of them wanted to. And you could go buy a quilt at Walmart or Sears or Penny's. You could clothe your family. You could get new socks. You didn't have to know how to darn socks. You didn't even know technically how to replace a button, though I still consider that an indispensable skill. And I refuse to sew buttons on for anyone. I will teach you how. But that said, quilting is one of those things that also underwent an identity crisis because nobody needed to make quilts anymore. Good quilters continued to make wedding quilts for family members, and a lot of families have wedding quilts or heirloom quilts in their homes. But the internet changed everything, and women getting jobs changed everything. I began to sew in the 1990s. About 1995, a group of us started meeting every week. We called it sewing time, very imaginative. And Linda was going to teach us how to sew clothes because we, for the most part, were homemakers and we wanted to know how. And it took me about 2 months to decide I was a complete and miserable failure at making clothes. Gave it up. Anything I've made, I won't wear. I cut up for quilting now. And Linda then said, well, if you want, I can teach you how to quilt. In a conversation, I said, I'd love to learn how to quilt. And the first thing she taught me was how to make a 9 patch, which is on the screen. That's not my 9 patch, that's just a generic 9 patch. It's one of the most simple quilt blocks that you can make. It's just 9 patches of different fabrics sewed together to make a bigger square. And then that's the 9 patch I made. And these are my sewing time buddies. And we all learned how to hand quilt on my 9 patch together on a frame every week. And it was awesome. And I gave up everything crafty at that point in my life to quilt. And I started churning out quilts every few months, all handmade, and loving every minute. I stopped cross-stitching, needlepoint, everything. So the most common kind of a quilt is what you see there. It's a pieced quilt. Now here's an example of a vintage quilt that a friend of ours lent us. She got it at an auction. This is a very old handmade quilt, hand-pieced, hand-quilted, hand-bound. This probably represents 6 months of a woman's life in her free time making. And then I had a desire at one point. I got tired of that quilt on my bed, and I'd always wanted a blue and white quilt. So I made a blue and white quilt for myself. And it's all machine pieced, machine quilted, machine bound. And it took about 4 months of my life, of my free time.
Will you explain the cutting, the buying, the stitching?
Actually, I didn't come here to actually do more than define quilting and show you how quilting has evolved since that identity crisis in the mid-century. If you want to talk afterwards, I am available. So, pieced quilts, like you see in the slide and what we just showed you, are by far the most common quilts. You cut up a bunch of fabric and reassemble it into patterns and designs. Now that was a collaboration between my friend Betty and I. She loves to piece, I love to quilt. Quilting meaning the stitching of the quilt. She made the quilt top, I made the quilt itself. And that's one of Betty's quilts. She's a very traditional, that's half of her quilts are hand pieced and hand quilted to this day. And that's one I did with a computer generated pattern, and I cut everything out with new notions and sewed it by machine, quilted it by machine. Very fun for me. The reason that this is the most common quilt is because it is easier than most of the other forms of bed quilting. It's precise. You can make beautiful patterns using beautiful fabrics that are available today. The next kind of quilting that I'm going to talk about is applique, and there are a lot of different kinds of applique quilting. Needle-turned applique is by far the most traditional quilting technique. It's been around for hundreds of years. It's wonderful because instead of the geometric lines, the straight lines that you need to do in pieced quilting, you know, to sew it all together, applique allows you to make very organic forms and flowery forms. But the reason it's not as popular as pieced is that it is incredibly time-consuming. As you can see here, just one small piece of fabric has to be held by the left hand, turned with a needle. The hem is turned under with a needle by the right hand, one stitch at a time, and just that little dot will have a minimum of 35 stitches to tack it to the background. So Lynn brought one of her hand appliqued, hand dyed, hand everything applique quilt. Everything here is hand done and hand applied, including the crystals. And she figured it out based on the number of hours it took her to do this and the materials. The minimum cost of a quilt like this is $450. And that's only making about $10 an hour. And so when you see handwork, a lot of times the reason it's so expensive, it's just, and it's also the reason not that many people do it. And when they do it, they don't sell it because nobody will buy it. The next kind, I'm sure everybody is, if you're familiar at all with quilting, you recognize Hawaiian quilting on site. It is basically 2 pieces of fabric make the top. You know when you were a child and you folded snowflakes out of, folded paper and cut things, and then you open it up and you had a snowflake? That's how they do this. And when they open it up, it's one big piece of fabric that looks like a snowflake, in my opinion, and it is needle turn appliqued to a background fabric. So essentially you're looking at two colors. And this is where it is done fusible, which I will explain in a minute. And every snowflake is a block. So it's done twice, two different ways. One huge applique, or a lot of small appliques in a block setting. Now, I did forget to mention that a quilt is technically two pieces of fabric with batting in between. That is what makes a quilt. Whatever else is on it, whatever else is done to it, if it has a top piece of fabric and a bottom piece of fabric with batting in between, it's a quilt. And here is one of the more modern. It is turned, but it's all machine quilted. English paper piecing is technically not applique, but I didn't know where else to put it in the slide, so I stuck it in with the applique because it's a similar technique, it's just not the same. Paper hexagons, all identical, with fabric attached to them and the edges folded under, and then instead of tacking these hexagons to a background, you're tacking them to each other. And here's a traditional setting of an English paper piecing project. Every single one of those little hexagons was mounted on paper, secured, and then attached to the neighbor. And then this one is a modern hexagon. Same process, just modern fabrics, modern design.
Paper. I'm having a hard time. There's paper on that.
English paper piecing, if you look, see the white? That's a piece of paper cut in a hexagon shape, and each piece of fabric is attached to it and sewed to it. And then the hexagons are attached to each other and the paper removed. Once you've removed the paper and made a quilt out of it with batting and backing, it's just as sturdy as anything else.
Oh, I see. So the paper kind of acts as a frame around the
It's a pattern, a template. Now, there are materials today available in the quilting world that are washable, that you can cut out like paper and leave in, and saves a lot of time that way. Reverse applique is applique reversed. Your focus fabric is placed under your background fabric. This is all in making the top. And then you sew your shape, in this instance a heart, and then you cut away the background fabric to reveal the focus fabric. Now this is just a very casual raw edge technique. If you wanted, you can baste the heart shape, cut out the heart shape, and then needle turn all that raw edge to get a little bit fancier. Or use felt that doesn't fray. There is a native group, I think from Southeast Asia, that make these. Shadow applique is essentially any kind of a quilt top. It could be pieced, it could be a printed panel, it could be a painting on fabric, whatever, that you then apply tulle, like in a bridal veil, to the surface, and then you baste it with your batting and backing and quilt it like a regular quilt, and it gives you this shimmery, shadowy effect that dims the image, but it doesn't detract from the fabric behind it. It adds to it. Instead of just these flat flowers, you've got this shimmery flower. Shadow applique. Now the final kind of applique that I'm going to talk about is fused applique. That is by far the most popular applique now because you don't have to turn the edges. You get to just make stuff up, and you use fusible products that are in the at Walmart, Joann's, Michael's, any of the craft shops. And the front fabrics, all the decorations, the flower petals, the butterfly, all those sorts of things have a fusible product applied to the back of them, and then they're just ironed to a background, and you make your picture by cutting out pieces and ironing it to your background. And when it's all done, you seal it with a hot steam iron, you baste it to a backing and batting, and you quilt it like a regular quilt. And the reason that it's one of the most popular is because it's so quick. I mean, all you have to do is put the sticky stuff on the fabric and cut the shapes out, and there you have it. Some people raw edge the edges. They don't want the raw edges and the threads and whatnot, and some people just leave them. I brought a, this is both fused and appliqued. Move over because the podium's in the way. But see, that's just drawing your design on a piece of paper, enlarging it, and then cutting out pieces of fabric to match the pieces of paper. Now, another extremely popular and modern kind of quilting is paper piecing, and it has its roots in foundation piecing from generations past, where women would attach colored pieces of fabric to a muslin base to secure it and stabilize it, especially when you're doing, for instance, crazy quilts, which have velvet and satin and lace and all kinds of neat things in it. They're applied to a foundation to stabilize them and keep them from pulling apart or fraying. And today, most paper piecers are using paper, and that is a modern invention. It was technically invented by a woman in 1981, but Carol Doak in 1995 came out, she published a book with 35 paper piecing patterns in it. Bestseller then, still a bestseller. It's a very accurate way of quilting. As you can see, if you're familiar at all with quilting, it's really hard to get points in your stars or even sometimes in your corners. With paper piecing, it's very simple and straightforward to get all those perfect points in there. None are cut off because you're really sewing on paper with the fabric behind it. Lynn brought a, this is a bedspread that we struggled over together in sewing time. Neither one of us are big fans of paper piecing. But as you can see, it's very consistent, very, all the circles are, there's no loppy-eared circles, and there's no cut-off points. It's a precision kind of a quilting if you want a lot of points, and you don't want to have to worry about the bias of the fabric where it stretches and gets wonky. So this was the one and only paper piece bedspread we've ever made. Because we don't like paper piecing. We don't like having to tear off all that paper when you're done stitching. But it's accurate, and it's consistent, and if you have poor eyesight, it's a really great way to quilt, because you just have to see the line on the paper. And we have a friend in Sewing Time who is in that situation.
And is this paper a special paper?
Well, you want to use something that tears easily. So when you're stitching the fabric and the paper together, you're making a very short stitch length so that the needle is perforating the paper very close together, so it's almost making it into the kind of paper you just tear off. But if you're using easy-to-tear paper already, or even vellum, then that makes the paper piecing process easier. But I've printed things onto regular old office paper and done it that way too. But that dulls your needle. You want to have a separate needle for your paper piecing. Now, this next, well, I'll show you a few paper pieced pictures. This is from our Sewing Time. We paper pieced this for Darla. This was a wedding quilt. Now, this is just a small art quilt, and when you're going to do something like this that's a picture, you really can't piece this the traditional way, because there are hundreds of tiny pieces in there. So paper piecing does lend itself to portraiture and and pictorial or landscape kind of quilts. But that is the only one I've ever done because it is very complicated. I mean, that quilt is this big, and it's got hundreds of tiny pieces of fabric in it.
You're telling me that each of those little giraffe things is a piece.
Yes, every leg is a piece. The nose is a piece. The ears are pieces. Just in the giraffe body on the top, there's about 25 pieces. And it's just to give it the curves that it needs to have. Yeah, some people adore this kind of quilting, and it is very popular. Just not one of my favorites. Alrighty, so this next kind is a whole cloth quilt. Once again, you have a top fabric, a bottom fabric, and batting in between. But instead of the appeal coming from all the different colors of fabrics reassembled in a pattern, you transfer or draw the quilting design onto the fabric and then quilt it. And all of the appeal comes from the quilting and not the fabric.
And is that done by machine?
Both. You will find, if you ever go to an Amish auction or anything, there will be some whole cloth quilts that have been done by hand. And then you will, I'll show you a machine in a second here. So this is done by machine. One color thread, one color fabric. That's a modern translation of whole cloth quilting. And then this next one, the thread, she used different colors of thread to create the interest, in addition to the complexity of the quilting itself. And that's all by machine with one fabric behind it.
I just can't imagine my machine being able, or my space being able to handle all of that.
Yeah, you're not kidding.
That's a lot of management of fabric.
It is. That's why a lot of people, like my blue and white quilt, I did not machine quilt it. I brought it to a long arm quilter. I now have a machine that can handle it, but at the time I didn't. It's here in town, Dawn O'Brien up on Madison is a long arm quilter, and you hire her, you bring your quilt top, and you hire her to baste the layers together. She puts it on her frame, like in the very beginning of my presentation, you saw a picture of us hand quilting at a frame. Well, a long arm frame is similar to that, but a lot more expensive and a lot fancier. And the quilt is on this long frame with two long rollers, and you have a machine that actually moves this way. Instead of moving the quilt, you're moving the machine, and it's got a long arm. So here's the body of the machine with all the knobs and the buttons, and then it goes across, and here's the harp, and then it goes across, and then there's the needle. Long arm. And with that, they can quilt any size quilt. So they could do a mural quilt. So now we get to one of my favorites now. I believe that all quilting today can be categorized as art because of the skill involved, the time it takes, and so much hand effort, so much personal effort. But when I had to come up with a category that's called mixed media, mixed techniques, art quilts, because with an art quilt, it's almost always going to hang on the wall, and it could involve a multitude of threads. It could involve metal, it could involve tissue, it could involve paper, cheesecloth, paint, dye, stenciling, bleach, discharge, resist techniques. I mean, anything in the art world can be done to a quilt. And so that's where I came up with this category. That is actually in the vault in Tuscola for sale for $950. And it's only that wide and that tall. But it took that much time to make.
Did you make it?
No, I didn't make it. Lynn made it.
Oh, just $950?
Well, personally, we both think that's a little modest, but we also think nobody will buy it, so she's safe.
My mother sold a quilt once for like $1,500.
Was it a bed quilt or an art quilt?
A bed quilt.
Yeah.
And it was crazy. As you said, it was crazy quilt.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
You probably sat like in silent shop for, 3 years, then someone finally found it.
And at $1,500, she was probably making 25 cents an hour.
Maybe. Yep.
I recently found a website of a woman who quilts, and she offered to quilt for people, but her price range was a twin bed quilt started at $2,500, a double started at $3,500, a queen started at $5,000, and a king started at $10,000. She would do quilts for that much.
Sure. That was a decent wage. $10 an hour.
Well, that would probably get her $15 to $20 an hour if it was machine work. But really, $15 to $20 is a modest wage. So
So what is the love, what do you call it, labors of love when you work for that?
typically, you will find a lot of quilters who won't even try to sell their work because it's too discouraging. You're putting a price on something that is not really priceable.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people just refuse to sell. I will make quilts for family, for friends who value the quilts. But even then, you have to be careful because I can't tell you how many quilters have said they made a quilt for their grandson, and the next time they were visiting, it was on the grass with a picnic on top of it. But, you know, it's discouraging to put in hundreds, if not thousands of hours on something. So I personally like to make money with my quilting. I have no qualms at all. But I won't do a bed quilt because, like I said, it's too expensive. This is my dog. This is technically a quilt. I call it my snippets portrait. And basically, I had a pink fabric, and I transferred itsy-bitsy snippets of fusible fabric and made my portrait. And then I fused it with an iron, and then I put tulle on top of it, so it's shadow applique also, to secure all the things that might come loose, and then hot fix crystals in the eyes, and it looks just like her.
Oh, that's cute. Oh, that's
This is just a sideways view of a quilt that I made, just to show you that that's just a silk flower from Walmart with some hot fix crystals. And they can have dimension. Portraits in shows, whatnot. And this is of a trip taken to Alaska. All the different events in the trip are in there. Now I combined my own love of photographs, taking pictures, with quilting to make quilted photographs.
You made quilted photographs.
I printed photographs onto fabric,
Yeah.
layered them like a quilt, and quilted them with my machine.
That is so cool. That's beautiful.
And I love it. And with Photoshop, you can fix things too, which is kind of cool. And you know, the technology, there are a lot of chemically treated fabrics that you can buy. They're kind of pricey, but they seal. This is just inkjet printing. It's not anything fancy. But you can seal the ink so it doesn't run. And then this is a fused applique portrait of my granddaughter. And it's just 4 fabrics, and I used Photoshop to fix the image into something that I could draw lines and cut out pieces.
Wow, quilting's come a long way.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why, that's one of the things I wanted to communicate today was how much quilting has evolved. Many people have an idea that all quilting is like that, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Well, it is at Sarah and Wally's house in Anchorage, Alaska. I have no idea that Parks, their last name is Parks. So I also, for the second half of the presentation, I also wanted to share with you some information that I gathered. I contacted 5 contemporary quilters today who essentially are a product of the evolution of quilting. And in very few cases have they ever done a traditional pieced quilt. The first one's name is Jane Dunwald. This is the email she wrote me. Hi, Cindy. Funny the confluence of events. I spent today moving things out of my studio so I could rent it to a young painter. I no longer need so much space, and in that clean out, I found some old things in a cedar chest that I'd forgotten about, including this quilt, which may be making its first appearance ever. She made this in 1979, and she calls it Locked in the Log Cabin. I don't know if you can see the little stuffed woman who is trapped in the log cabin. Right here. She's a little stuffed head with little stuffed arms, screaming to be released. Jane wrote, having been married and divorced twice, I can't help but think nostalgically that it was a forewarning of my own desire to be independent. Now, I asked these different quilters to send me pictures old to new so that we could see the transformation in their own quilting and experience with textiles. That's the little lady. I'm just glad there's no face on her. That would be hard to do. She uses a lot of printed imagery to communicate a concept. And you can just see the faded mothers and babies in here. And this was made long enough ago that the technology for printing on fabric was not nearly what it is today. So that's why they look so shadowy. It was just, and it makes it part of the appeal today. She didn't send me dimensions, so I don't really know how big these are. Now, these next two pictures are her more current. This is what she does now. She has combined her love of photography with fabric, her love of textiles, to take pictures, alter them, and then send the images to spoonflower.com and have her own images printed on cotton fabric for sale at her website. So this is her fabric, her design, her color choices. And it's from her photograph in Barbados. Picture of a dahlia. Dahlia? Yes. She says, I overdye, print maps, and other human recording instruments, all a comment on our human predilection to impose our own means of understanding the world on all its other inhabitants. And when I read things like this, I just wonder what my great-grandmother would have thought if a quilter had said that. She'd be, huh? Just, that's how far quilting has come. The next one is Ann Johnston. Her first quilt was made in order to make a bed covering for the straw mattress she and her husband were sleeping on in Lima, Peru, where she was teaching new math. And because there was such a limited palette of fabrics, she began to dye her own, and these are quilts that she has made since that day in Peru. The impetus for my work is the world around me. Shapes, patterns, colors, textures. I work toward a goal in each quilt I make, having a particular concept in mind. I allow the design to evolve. So all of her quilts, they don't really fit into one category. Now that's all hand quilting there, those little dots that make those designs. This is a hand-dyed fabric that she did some, I don't know if you're familiar with the paints you can put on fabric, then you put leaves on it, put it in the sun, and it changes the color of the fabric in leaf shapes. My next quilter is Eileen Dowdy. She's big in landscape quilting. She loves to landscape quilt. Pictures. This was her first quilt, her first landscape quilt in 1987. She used bleach splattered on these rocks to make the foam of the surf. And then, of course, you have to stop the bleaching action with whatever it's called. And there's sequins attached to give it sparkle. She went to a workshop, read a magazine about landscape quilting, and hasn't looked back. She just loves making landscapes. Now here was a wedding quilt that she made for a relative's friend, but even here she said you can see the tree theme starting. In the corners there's a artistic rendering of a tree. And this is called Bargello quilting. It's a pieced quilt, but she has all the trees of Vivaldi's music, you know, spring, summer, winter, and fall. This is what her mom did. Now, her mom is one of those quilters that will not sell her quilts. They are all a labor of love. She quilts for family. So the last two pictures she gave me after this one, I wanted to introduce before you see them, because they're a couple of her recent works, and the tagline is, "I realized that I loved thread so much, I dropped out the fabric." Thread, that's it. Just thread. My next is Hollis Chatelaine. She sent me two images. One is called Underwater Gardens. That's in this picture. And the other one is called Innocence. Much of my work is influenced by personal experiences. I make imagery that evokes an emotional response and creates a mood or atmosphere. When I am at peace, I dream images and color. When my life is chaotic, I dream people and events. My dreams are lucid, always in color, and that's what I quilt. The 12 years I lived in Africa have deeply influenced me. 6 months after moving back to the United States, my longing for Africa was so great that I started to paint African images in order to put me back into the life I loved so much. In Innocence, this is a hand-painted quilt with dye. And the dye has a thickener added so that it's the consistency of acrylic paint. And it's machine quilted, and it's based on a dream she had. In the dream, there were children in his face. How she did that was she quilted the children into his face with thread. And her children are in this. There are some child prostitutes. There is a child warrior. One of her nieces is in this. The children were from all over the world, and in many situations. They were laughing, playing, eating, and working. They seemed to be telling me to pay attention to the children in our world, to speak for them and tell their stories, for they are the innocent ones. They are in peril in many places and have no voice. And then this is a close-up of her underwater gardens. Now, if you've heard of Ricky Timms, you are not alone. He's probably one of the most well-known quilters in the quilt world. This is the one and only pieced traditional quilt he made. He made it in 1991. Sorry, it's right there. And he said at that point he didn't know there were still quilters in the world. There were no quilt shops where he lived. He had a book, and he did it from a book. And then he discovered that there were quilters out there, and that there were a lot of books out there and a lot of things that you can do, and he stopped doing the traditional stuff. The next year, he did his first commissioned quilt from a portrait, or a photograph. It was a commission from a photograph. That same year, he did Fan Dance, which he designed, and he only designed and did this in order to get better at needle turn applique. This is needle turned applique.
Wow.
So, which brings me back to my topic, the Worldwide Quilting Bee. I told you that I think quilting underwent a complete transformation in the 90s with the internet. What the internet did, between 1995 and 2000, the internet grew by 100% every year. And what the internet did is it brought quilting into everybody's home that was interested, and it connected quilters. And that is a key ingredient, connecting quilters. Connecting them with the information they needed, connecting them with the supplies they wanted, and connecting them with other quilters to talk, to share, to critique, to love one another. It left our living rooms and it went everywhere. And these are just some pictures from my own sewing time group and some get-togethers that we had, just showing off our various quilts and comparing our quilts and making quilts for weddings, indoors and out, didn't matter. The impact of the internet cannot be overestimated. And I think this is kind of ironic because this same month, the Technology and Science Symposium is running here at Eastern, and it's all about the impact of the internet and technology. Well, it had a huge impact on quilting. It had a huge impact on everything. In 1994, the quilting industry was worth $1.5 billion, and it probably would have remained there, just like I probably would still be making 9 patches for all I know. But because of the internet, and this is my opinion, there is no proof, but because of the internet, it is in 2010, the quilting industry was worth $3.5 billion. It's a huge leap. And there are multi-million-dollar quilt competitions, there are international quilt shows, there are workshops galore, online and off. There are local quilt shops in almost every other town. And you can buy anything notion-wise and fabric-wise you want on the internet and have it delivered free shipping and everything if you have Amazon Prime. And it's cheaper to order it now than it is to go to Walmart. And Walmart's kind of limited. This is just our sewing group, just quilting away.
You come for an hour?
No, 4 hours a day, once a week. Every Friday, which we happen to cancel today. Yeah, and it used to be 2 hours, and it just wasn't long enough to solve all the world's problems and drink all the coffee, so we doubled it. And
I'm noticing a lot of light,
yes.
which I would need if I was a
Oh yeah, you can't quilt without light. And these are my friends, and at that point we were making a quilt for Lynn, who had lost her mother. We were making a hug quilt, which is my next slide. A hug quilt is also something kind of modern, and it grew directly out of the connection of quilters across state lines, across national borders. RCTQ is the abbreviation for a Usenet news group. In the early days of the internet, there wasn't any Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or any of these social networking sites. The only way you networked socially was through Usenet. It was all text, no graphics, no color, but anybody that was interested in something could develop a group, and then all the people in the world who were interested in that could find you and join you and talk about your stuff. RCTQ was one of the most vibrant and active Usenet news groups ever, and it still exists today, as well as having a group on Facebook. It stands for Recreation, Crafts, Textiles, Quilts, each category narrowing down the interest to quilts. And that's where I would get patterns, I would get information, I would get questions answered. And a hug quilt is basically if some member of the group anywhere in the world suffered some kind of a loss or grief, everybody else would make a 6.5-inch quilt block, sign it with their name, sign it with their location, and then send it to somebody who was willing to make that quilt, assemble all the blocks, and then present it to the person who needed the hug. So it's called a hug quilt, and all the people were hugging her when you wrap up in that quilt. Now I have my own hug quilt. When my father died 10 years ago, quilters from all over the world made this for me and sent the blocks to a local friend, Karen, with a music theme, because at the time I was a piano teacher. And there were so many blocks sent. Oh, that was dumb. I just did the same side again. Both sides are pieced. And you're welcome to come up later and look at it. almost every single block is signed with the maker's name and where they're from. And I've got international blocks on here. And it's a precious quilt for me. Yes. No, what happens, for instance, if I find out that so-and-so is going to make a hug quilt for her sister or another member of the group or whatever because they've lost somebody in their life, even a pet, then the notice goes out. I make a quilt block out of my own fabric called a stash. My fabric is a stash, and it's considerable, and I'm proud of it. And I make a 6.5-inch block. It can be any quilting technique I want. And then I send that block to the person making the quilt, and they assemble all the blocks, and then it goes to the person needing the hug. So there's no exchange of fabric or patterns or anything. It's all my fabric, my pattern, everything.
There's something about that they all look like they coordinate.
Well, this coordinates because the person who made the quilt requested either music fabrics or batik fabrics. Now, if you're familiar with batik fabrics, they are beautiful, top quality fabric that are usually very vibrant, and they all have a similar feel to them, and that's what you're seeing. And then the music theme, there are a lot of fabrics that have music in them that aren't batik, but you put it all together and you have me, color and music and life. I love it. And if the person loves green and purple, they got a quilt that was mostly green and purple. But I couldn't be pinned down on a favorite, so.
I have a little story.
Yeah?
It's similar to the hugs thing. My church will have this similar thing, and then all of us as parishioners can go and tie a knot.
Mm.
And that's our way of saying that we're sending our love to the person whose mom is sick or
Yes.
a new baby or whatever. So it's kind of a hug quilt in a different
Yes,
way.
it is. And if you go back to the Civil War, there were women who would get together on a regular basis, and when they weren't sewing socks and uniforms, they were sewing quilts for soldiers at the front. And they were signing blocks. And there were even signatures. They've got some of these preserved today. There were even some quilt blocks that were signed with personal information, unmarried, look me up when you get back, kind of stuff. And that's Civil War. I mean, that's the old-time social networking. It is. Now, another thing that is much more common now than ever because of the internet and because of our connection all over are charity quilts, which this is an example of quilts that we made up in the space of a month when Katrina hit, to send down for children who that lost their homes. And there's Linus quilts, and there's Snuggle quilts. There are organizations making charity quilts for homeless animals, even, and babies in need. And there is even a place that accepts itsy bitsy quilts for babies who die after being born, and they wrap them in these itsy bitsy quilts for burial. So there's quilts being made for everything, and in a minute, our next speaker is going to be talking about a local charity kind of a quilting effort. Then there is the quilt inspector. Now, I imagine this is not a modern phenomenon. I believe that this has happened ever since there has been a quilt. If there is a quilt on the floor, or for those households that allow animals on the bed, and if there is an animal in the house, that animal will find that quilt, and I don't care what you do to stop it. If it's in reach, animals find quilts, and we call them quilt inspectors, or QIs for short. And this quilt isn't even assembled yet, and she's on it. Yes, my dogs have quilts. Oh, yes. So, in conclusion, I think that the internet gave artists an outlet, motivation, tools, and most of all, connection. And I think that if love could be measured in quilts, the world from the top to the bottom is covered in love, because quilts have been sent everywhere, from everywhere. So thank you for being here. We still have another speaker, so don't leave. Thanks.
I'll talk real fast.
Can I take your thing?
Oh yeah, it's Katie's. Anyway. Oh, I've got a microphone. I was going to go home with this. I got it.
Thank you so much.
That was fascinating. Thanks so much. 'Cause I know nothing about quilting.
Oh, good. Did you put it in the same slot? While you're doing that, I'll bring a quilt around for them to be distracted by.
You want to check out the slot?
Yeah.
Hey, Lynn? You want to grab your snowflake?
On a completely sort of different subject, I am not a quilter, but I play one on TV. No, I work with a group of quilters. I have been both serving as a volunteer and a researcher at Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, which is a men's maximum security prison in Indiana, about 30 miles south of Terre Haute. And I've been doing that about 4.5 years now. And in my different capacities there, I have gotten to know a particular group of inmates fairly well, who live in a particular cell house in the prison known as the PLUS program. And the PLUS program, PLUS stands for Purposeful Living Unit Serve. And I guess to some extent you'd sort of call it an honor dorm within the prison. Still maximum security facility, but there's a little more flexibility within the environment. And there's also a very strong service component as part of living in that particular cell house. One thing that some of the inmates started doing about 5 or 6 years ago was quilting. They became very interested in the idea of quilting as a service activity, personal development activity. And between 5 and 6 years ago, they started this whole process, and it's just sort of exploded since then. I brought with me some copies of, which I'll leave them here, an article called Felonious Quilting that appeared in the Quilter magazine 2 years ago, written by Kevin Henry, who is one of the inmates that I work with, about the dawn of the quilting within the PLUS program at Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, its purpose, its healing function, all those types of things. So I will leave those there if people are interested. And as they moved more forward with their quilting, they focused on different causes, different target groups, I guess you could say. And their most common one is veterans or family members who have lost someone in Iraq or Afghanistan, and I'll show you some of those quilts in a minute. They've spread out from there while the veterans were sort of their first focus, and as Kevin, the author of the article, talks about, that was sort of part of the inspiration for getting quilting going to begin with. Both Kevin and the other person who started the quilting program were veterans themselves. They had both been Marines before they went to prison, and as they saw more and more news coverage, they thought, we want to do something supportive for family members. And like I said, it's spread since then. Riley Children's Hospital, they donate a lot of quilts to for the NICU unit, and also to humane societies in central and southern Indiana. And they also started a project a few years ago to outfit every state police car in Indiana with a quilt. And the reason for that being is that lots of times a first responder arrives on a scene and it's a traumatic situation, whether it's a car accident or something, and to have some sort of support or warmth or a hug quilt almost sort of thing, that they carry the quilt in their car to then wrap around the person who's dealing with the trauma at that particular time. A few quilts here to show you in honor of our troops. And I'd actually done a service learning project with my Aging in the Family class 3 years ago, where the students did a short life review project with a veteran. And then we teamed up equally with the prison and the Plus unit, and all of the prisoners in the Plus unit who work on quilts did a quilt for each of the veterans to thank them for their service and their participation in the activity. And that was just a small thing on the back that they had sewn on there. Perhaps the biggest service-related quilt they did in relation to the troops was this particular ginormous quilt. I think it's 40 by 60. 30 by 40 feet. At this point, there's 6,500 squares in it. This is a picture of it in the cell house. You can see like the top range and the bottom range of the cell, and as they're working on it to raise it. It was in the Indiana State Museum for a period of time. Each square represents a fallen hero in Iraq or Afghanistan. It has that person's name and personal information and gets sewn onto the quilt. At last count, there were 6,261 names, unfortunately, on the quilt. And the quilt will continue to be added to. And the flag quilt was flown in the Indiana State Museum for a while, and now it rests in Sullivan County Courthouse in Sullivan County, Indiana, not Illinois. There's a very interesting interview also, if you can Google it, on the making of the quilt from both the prison and inmate point of view, and the purpose of the quilt, etc. Then there are different causes that the inmates have quilted for as well. The one on the right, yay, go Eastern, they did 2 or 3 quilts. They get permission to do 2 or 3 quilts for me for last year for the Alzheimer's Shall We Dance event, and their auction that took place there. The prison agreed that, yeah, that would be fine, that we could have a few quilts made with some EIU stuff on it for auction. All of their quilts, all of their quilting materials come from donations. And after that article was written a few years ago, they got donations from all over the country. And they're honing their skills over time and developing their creative quilting abilities. And so this is, you can see the cell house where the quilting takes place, and they have a few large tables like that to work on, and they do some hand sewing as well as machine sewing. And I brought 2 quilts with me that the inmates, this one was one of more of their generic ones for, yeah, they make some big quilts. And then the other one, oh, okay, thank you. The other one that I have,
If there's a head quilter, like a person that manages the quilting process, or are they all pretty equally?
they're all pretty equal, or they teach each other as the process goes on, the few that got really skilled at it. And then this quilt, actually, for those of you who know me and have been in my office, have seen this quilt. And my guys, as I call them, a group of prisoners that I work really closely with, made this for me to thank me for being a volunteer. And it has greyhounds on it, because I have greyhounds. And so they managed to get greyhounds on there as well, and they signed the back and gave it to me and surprised me. And so now it hangs in my office. And how cool. I was so touched. Thank you. So I'm wrapping up here. And also, and actually that's a former grad student from communication who did some research and her thesis at Wabash Valley, and when she finished there, they surprised her with the quilt as well to take with her when she was done. So you can see some of their work that they've done. I feel like now I have all these techniques I want to like bring to them, or bring books more about quilting. One of the inmates who does the quilting says it won't erase the damage we have caused, but by helping others, even in a small way, maybe we can at least lessen their pain. And so it's just a very interesting, creative outlet for some, I guess, positive change. And so that was it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you sort of going toward lunch. So thank you very much.